Mary remembered the full horror of the past week and the new knowledge that had come to her. "Mr. Davy, have you ever heard of wreckers? My uncle is one of them. He told me so himself." "So the landlord talks when he is drunk." It seemed to Mary that his voice lacked something of its usual gentle quality. "He talks, yes," she answered. "When my uncle has lived on brandy for 5 days, he'll bare his soul before the world." The gale had increased in force during their conversation. Francis Davy leant forward in his seat. "We are approaching the turning to Alternan. The driver is bound to Bodmin and will take you to Jamaica Inn. Am I the only man you have honoured with your confidence?" "Jem Merlyn knows," Mary said unwillingly. "We spoke of it this morning. Anyway, it doesn't matter now. Jem rides to custody for another crime." "And suppose he could save his own skin by betraying his brother. What then, Mary Yellan?" Mary made a helpless movement with her hands, and he must have seen the despair in her face, for his voice became gentle again. "I will tell you one thing for consolation. I returned tonight from a meeting in Launceston, and those of us present were informed that His Majesty's government were to take steps to patrol the coast. There will be watchers on the cliffs instead of flares, and the paths known only at present to men like your uncle and his companions will be trodden by officers of the law. The false lights have flickered for the last time." He fastened his coat, lifted the sash of the window, and called to the driver to rein in his horse. He stepped out into the road, bared his head and smiled. "Your troubles are over. Sleep well tonight. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and the bells at Alternan will be ringing for peace and goodwill." The carriage rattled on along the Bodmin road. Mary sat in the corner, and through the open window, travelling down upon the wind, she heard the voices of men and the padding of feet upon the road. A shot rang out, and the driver of the carriage crumpled in his seat and fell. For a moment the carriage swayed upon its wheels, rocked, and was still. A face was thrust in at the window, a face crowned with matted hair that fell in a fringe above the scarlet, bloodshot eyes. One hand held a lantern, and the other clasped the smoking barrel of a pistol. They were long, slim hands, with narrow, pointed fingers. Joss Merlyn leaned forward so that the barrel touched Mary's throat. Then he laughed, and wrenching open the door, he pulled her out beside him on the road. He tilted her face to the light, and when the others saw who she was, a howl of laughter broke from them. "So it's you," the landlord said. "And what do you think you do at midnight, riding on the King's highway in a hired carriage?" He jerked at her wrist, and she fell. "Leave me alone," she said. "You're a murderer and a thief, and the law knows it too. I've been to Launceston today to inform against you." A hubbub rose amongst the group of men. They pressed forward, shouting at her and questioning. "Get back, you damned fools! Can't you see she's trying to save her skin by lies?" Joss Merlyn pointed to the sky, where the low clouds fled before the scurrying wind and a wet star gleamed. "Look there! There'll be more wind yet, and a wild grey dawn on the coast in 6 hours' time. We'll waste no more of it here. Who'll take the road to the coast with me?" A shout rose from a dozen voices. Joss Merlyn stood for a moment, looking down upon Mary with a foolish, drunken smile. Then, on a sudden impulse, he pulled her towards the carriage, wrenching the door open. He threw her onto the seat in the corner and yelled to the peddler to whip the horses up the hill. "You think you're not afraid of me, don't you? Well, tonight, you shall come with us, Mary, to the coast." It was a nightmare journey of 2 hours or more to the coast, aware only of pain and the rocking carriage wheels, Mary felt herself slip away into darkness. It was the cessation of movement that dragged her back to the world, and the cold, damp air blowing upon her face through the open carriage window. She was alone in her corner. The men had gone. The carriage had been abandoned in a narrow gullyway with high banks on either side. Mary tried the handle of the door, but it was locked. Borne up to her on the wind came the sound of the sea. The gully was a pathway to the shore. Mary shuddered. Somewhere in the darkness below, her uncle and his companions waited for the tide. Mary found inactivity impossible. She considered the size of the window, and leaning backwards through the gap, she struggled and pushed her way through, and fell to the ground below. She crept uncertainly up the lane, which, judging by the sound of the sea, was taking her straight to the shore. Suddenly, not 50 yards away, she saw the high, combing seas breaking upon the shore. When her eyes had accustomed themselves to the shadows, she made out a little knot of men grouped together, silently peering ahead into the darkness. Their silence and stillness made them the more menacing. To the right in the distance, where the highest part of the cliff sloped to the sea, Mary made out a faint pinprick of light. It was like a small white eye in the darkness. The group of men on the shingle below heeded it not. And suddenly Mary was aware of the reason for their indifference. The star was a false light, placed there by her uncle and his companions. As Mary watched, out of the mist and darkness came another pinprick of light, which drew nearer to the first like a moth to a candle, the one compelled by the other. Now Mary could see the shadowed outline of a hull, and she could bear no more. She scrambled to her feet and ran down upon the beach, shouting and crying. Someone caught hold of her and forced her down upon the shingle. Hands stifled her. She was trodden upon and kicked. Her cries died away, smothered by the coarse sacking that choked her, and her arms were dragged behind her back and knotted together. As she lay there helpless, Mary saw the black mass that had been a vessel roll slowly upon its side like a great flat turtle. A deadly sickness came upon her, and she closed her eyes, her face pressed into the shingle. The silence and the stealth were gone. The men who had waited ran like madmen hither and thither upon the beach, yelling and screaming, demented and inhuman, all caution spent, snatching at the bobbing, sodden wreckage borne in on the surging tide. Whatever had been the practice hitherto, there was no method in their work tonight. They robbed haphazard, each man for himself, crazy and drunk with success. The tide turned, the water receded, and a new chill came upon the air. Joss Merlyn lifted his great head and shouted suddenly, calling the men to silence, pointing to the sky. They hesitated, then turned with one accord and began to run up the beach towards the entrance of the gully. Joss jerked Mary to her feet and threw her over his shoulder as he would a sack. He ran with her up the strand to the entrance of the gully. His companions, caught up in a mesh of panic, worked without direction. The carriage, stuck in the bank halfway up the gully, was wrenched out in so rough a manner that it overturned, rolling upon one side and smashing a wheel. This final disaster let loose pandemonium. There was a wild rush to the remaining farm cart, and the riot that followed was a hideous scrap of tooth and nail, and those who carried pistols now had the advantage. The landlord, with his remaining ally, Harry the peddler, by his side, stood with his back to the cart and let fly amongst the rabble, mortally wounding too. At the sight of their dying fellows, the remaining rebels turned as one man and scuttled like crabs up the twisting lane. Without a word, Joss Merlyn and the peddler climbed into the cart and jerked the horse to action. Lying on her back in the cart, Mary heard from far away the merry peal of bells, odd and discordant in the morning air. She remembered suddenly that it was Christmas Day. The square pane of glass was familiar to her. Mary moaned and turned her head restlessly from side to side. Out of the tail of her eye, she saw the brown, discoloured wall beside her. She was lying in her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. Her hands were held gently, and the eyes that peered at her, red-rimmed from weeping, were tremulous and blue. It was Aunt Patience. "How long have I lain here?" Mary questioned, and she was told that this was the second day. For a moment or two Mary was silent. "You should have woken me," she said roughly. "There's work for me to do. You don't understand." "You could not move," Aunt Patience whimpered. "Your poor body was bleeding and broken." "You know who did it, don't you? You know where they took me." Mary sat up and began to drag on her clothes. "Oh, Mary, do not anger him again," her aunt pleaded. "Ever since he returned with you, he has sat below, white and terrible, a gun across his knees. The doors of the inn are barred. Don't go down, Mary. I beg you not to go down." "Aunt Patience, I have gone through enough out of loyalty to you. Uncle Joss murdered men on the shore. Don't you understand?" Her voice rose dangerously high. The door opened, and the landlord stood on the threshold. "I thought I heard voices in the yard," he said. "Did you hear anything from this room?" Aunt Patience shook her head, the little nervous smile trailing uneasily across her face. He sat down on the bed, his restless eyes roaming from the window to the door. "He'll come," he said. "He's bound to come. I've cut my own throat. I've gone against him. He warned me once, and I laughed at him. We're as good as dead, all three of us." They stared at him, dumbfounded and awed at the expression on his face. "What do you mean?" said Mary at length. "Who are you afraid of? Who warned you?" "You'd like to know, wouldn't you, Mary Yellan?" He shambled to his feet, dragging her after him into the passage, and led the way into the kitchen, where the door was bolted and the windows barred. 2 candles were on the table to light the room. He turned and faced the 2 women. "We've got to think out a plan of campaign. We've been sitting here for nigh on 2 days now, like rats in a trap, and I have had enough." His wife stole over to him and plucked at his jacket. "Why can't we creep away now, before it's too late?" she whispered. "We could travel by night. We could make for the eastern counties." "You damned idiot! Don't you realize there are people on the road between here and Launceston who are only waiting their chance to fasten what happened on the coast on Christmas Eve on me? And if they see us bolting, they'll have the proof they need. No. We've got one chance. One single chance in a million. We've got to lie quiet." He broke off short, his face as white as a sheet. "Listen. Listen." Something was scraping gently at the kitchen window, tapping lightly, softly, scratching furtively at the pane of glass. There was no sound in the kitchen except the frightened breathing of Aunt Patience. Mary watched the landlord as he stood motionless on the kitchen floor. Then he bent forward and his fingers fastened themselves upon his gun that stood against the farther chair. For a moment he waited beside the closed shutters, and then he sprang forward, tearing at the hinges and pulling them apart. A man stood outside the window. It was Harry the peddler. Joss Merlyn swore and threw open the window. "God damn you! Come inside, can't you? Well, have you brought news?" The peddler jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "The country's gone up in smoke," he said. "They're hot mad for blood and justice, too. We've got to run for it. It's our only chance." "So you'll throw your hand in, Harry, will you? Run with your tail between your legs? Has your liver conscience gone against you?" "Damn my conscience, Joss. It's common sense I'm thinking of."
It's like this, Joss. I don't see the fun in quitting empty-handed. There's a mint of stuff we dumped along in the room yonder 2 days ago from the shore, but there's none left to claim it but you and I. And it'll take 2 men to shift it.
The landlord puffed thoughtfully at his pipe.
You're teeming with ideas, my friend. And supposing the stuff isn't there, after all?
The grin faded from the face of the peddler. What do you mean? Do you play a double game up here at Jamaica? You've made a brilliant job of this trade month in, month out. Too brilliant, some of us thought. But we didn't ask you how you did it. Do you take your orders from one above you? The landlord was on him like a flash. He caught the peddler on the point of the chin with his clenched fist, and the man went over backwards onto his head. The landlord towered above him, the muzzle of his gun pointed at the peddler's throat.
Move, and you're a dead man. I'm the leader in this game and always have been. I take orders. My God, I'd like to see the man who dared to try me. You didn't come here tonight to warn me, Harry, you little rat. You came to see what you could get out of the smash. Very well. We'll strike a bargain, you and I. Tomorrow is Sunday, and a blessed day of rest. Not even the wrecking of 50 ships will drag the people of this country from their knees. 24 hours we have, Harry, my boy. And tomorrow night, when you've broken your back spading turf and turnips over my property in the farm cart, you can go free with your life, instead of lying in a ditch with a bullet in your black heart. Come on. You shall spend the night in the storeroom amongst the wreckage.
And putting his gun into the peddler's back, he prodded him out of the kitchen and down the dark flagged passage to the store. After he had turned the key on his friend, the landlord returned to the kitchen.
I thought Harry would turn sour. I've seen it coming. You'd better go to bed, Mary. You have a long journey before you tomorrow night.
Mary looked at him across the table, her mind seething with plans. Sometime, somehow, before tomorrow night, she must go to Alternan. She turned to the dresser for her candle and went out into the dark passage. Her uncle followed her up to the bedroom over the porch.
"Give me your key," he said. "I want no prowlers in the passage."
She handed it to him without a word, and he shut the door upon her and locked it. Mary woke to the sound of earth flung against the pane of glass from the yard outside. She crept softly to the window and cried out in surprise. It was Jem Merlyn, standing below her in the yard. She leant forward at once, opening her window, and would have called to him, but he lifted his hand for silence. He cupped his hands to his mouth and whispered up to her, "Come down and unbolt the door for me." She shook her head at him. "I cannot. I'm locked in my room." He stared at her, nonplussed and evidently puzzled. Then he swung himself to the low roof of the jutting porch and hauled himself up the porch to a level with her window. "I shall have to talk to you here," he said. He looked worn, and his eyes were hollow like one who has not slept, and there were lines about his mouth she had not noticed before. "I owe you an apology. I deserted you without excuse at Launceston on Christmas Eve. I can't give you the reason." Mary was hurt by his manner. He did not even ask her how she returned that night, and his indifference stunned her. "Why are you locked in your room?" he questioned. She shrugged her shoulders. "My uncle does not care for eavesdroppers." "To ask you why you are here tonight would be an offense, I suppose." "Oh, be as bitter as you like. I deserve it. But I'm treading delicate ground, Mary, and one false step will finish me. Where is my brother? He told us he would spend the night in the kitchen. He is afraid of something or someone. The windows and doors are barred, and he has a gun." Jem laughed harshly. "I don't doubt he's afraid. I came here to see him, but if he sits there with a gun across his knee, I can postpone my visit until tomorrow when the shadows are gone. Tomorrow may be too late. What do you mean? He intends to leave Jamaica Inn. Jem was silent. The news had evidently come as a surprise to him. Mary watched him, tortured by doubt and indecision. He was like a stranger to her tonight, obsessed by some grim purpose she could not understand. But whatever Jem had done or intended to do, she loved him and owed him a warning. You'd best have a care for yourself when you see your brother. His mood is dangerous. I have no fear of Joss. He leaned forward suddenly and touched the scratch that ran from her forehead to her chin. Who did this? He said sharply, turning from the scratch to the bruise on her cheek. She hesitated a moment and then answered him. I got them Christmas Eve. The gleam in his eye told her at once that he understood and had knowledge of the evening, and because of it was here now at Jamaica Inn. You were with them on the shore? She nodded, watching him carefully, wary of speech. He cursed aloud and, reaching forward, smashed the pane of glass with his fist. The gap in the window was wide enough now for entrance, and he climbed into the room. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed and sat down beside her. God almighty, why did you go with them? They were crazy with drink. I don't think they knew what they were doing. I could no more have stood against them than a child. There were a dozen of them or more, and my uncle, he led them. He and the peddler. If you know about it, why do you ask me? He sat silently beside her. Was it my brother who hurt you most? She sighed wearily. I've told you he was drunk. You know better than I, perhaps, what he can do then. He shall die for this. His death will not bring back the men he killed. What do you intend to do? He asked. Something which has no concern with you, but might bring you to danger. I can't say any more. I would rather you trusted me. Trust you? Good God, of course I trust you. It's you who won't trust me, you damned little fool. He put his arms around her, and he kissed her deliberately. Play your own game by yourself, then, and leave me to play mine. But God knows I wish you 100 miles away. He rose from the bed and went towards the window, climbing through the gap he had broken in the pane, and, swinging his legs over the porch, he lowered himself to the ground. Mary sat on her bed, waiting until her door should be unlocked, and she made her plans for the evening to come. She would have to leave Jamaica Inn secretly and unobserved, and run like a hare to Alternan. If her uncle were to suspect nothing, she would have to return to the inn and trust that her absence had remained unobserved. Their fate would then be in the hands of Francis Davy. Beyond that she could not think. When day came, the long hours stretched interminably before her. During the midday meal, the landlord sat silent and wrapped in gloom. When it was finished, Mary helped her aunt with the preparations for the journey. If we are to travel tonight, she said at length, would it not be better if Aunt Patience and myself rested now during the afternoon, and so could start out fresh upon the journey? You may rest if you will, her uncle said grudgingly. There will be no sleep for you tonight. Go then. I shall be well rid of you for the time. Mary entered her room, her heart beating fast at the prospect of adventure. She put on her warmest dress and fastened her old shawl across her shoulders with trembling hands. It was about 4 o'clock when she climbed out onto the porch and dropped to the ground, as Jem had done that morning, and strode out towards her destination. She came at length to Alternan, and went to the vicarage beside the church. There were no lights. The house was shrouded and silent, and there was no reply to her knock. Cursing her stupidity, She turned back towards the church. Francis Davy would be there, of course. It was Sunday. She hesitated a moment, and then the gate opened and a woman came out into the road. Mary turned and followed her. "Forgive me," she said. "I see you have come from the church. Can you tell me if Mr. Davy is there?" "No, he is not," said the woman. "Were you wishing to see him?" "Very urgently," said Mary. "I have been to his house, and I can get no answer. Can you help me?" The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "The vicar is from home. He is not expected back in Altonan tonight. I keep house for him. Is there any message you would like me to give him when he does return?" "It will be too late," Mary said in despair, trying desperately to think of some way out of the situation. "Who is the nearest magistrate?" she said at length. "There's no one close by us here in Altonan," the woman said doubtfully. "The nearest would be Squire Bassett over to North Hill." "Is the road hard to find?" Mary asked. "No, that's easy enough, but it's scarcely a walk for a maid like you after nightfall. There's rough folk on the moors at times. You'd best stay here and wait for the vicar." "That is impossible," said Mary. "But if you have pen and paper, I will write him a note." She followed the woman to her cottage and wrote desperately, never pausing to choose her words. She gave the note to the woman and set out again upon a walk of 4 miles or more to North Hill with a heavy heart. She could only look upon the approaching interview with Squire Bassett with trepidation. She came to the lodge gates of the manor house belonging to the squire and went down the avenue to the house as the church clock struck 7. She swung the great bell, and presently the door was opened by a manservant. "I have come to see Mr. Bassett on very urgent business," she told him. "The matter is of desperate importance. Otherwise I would not disturb him at such an hour, and on a Sunday night." "Mr. Bassett left for Launceston this morning," answered the man. "He was called away hurriedly, and has not yet returned." "If I do not see him within the hour, a great criminal will escape the hands of the law. If only there was someone I could turn to." "Well, Mrs. Bassett is at home," said the man. "Perhaps she will see you, if your business is as urgent as you say. Follow me, will you?" Mary crossed the hall to the library. A woman whom she recognized immediately as the fine lady from Launceston Market Square was sitting in a chair before the fire. The servant began his explanation in some excitement. "This young woman has very grave news for the squire, madam," he said. Mrs. Bassett rose to her feet. "What can I do for you?" she said graciously. "You look pale and fatigued. Won't you sit down?" Mary shook her head. "Thank you, but I must know when Mr. Bassett is returning." "I have no idea," replied his lady. "From what he told me, he intends to go to Jamaica Inn tonight to seize the inhabitants. The squire has suspected the landlord for some while of terrible crimes, but full proof only came into his hands this morning." Mary, her face white, said, "I am the landlord of Jamaica Inn's niece, but by marriage only. I came here to warn Mr. Bassett that the landlord intended to leave the inn tonight. I have definite proof of his guilt, which I did not believe Mr. Bassett to possess. How did the squire learn the truth so suddenly?" "I have not the slightest idea. Now, won't you rest? You are probably famished for want of food." Mrs. Bassett pulled the bell, and when the servant appeared, asked him to bring a tray of supper for Mary. When she had finished her meal, she sat with her hands on her lap, staring at the fire. But when the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8 o'clock, Mary could bear it no longer. "Forgive me," she said, rising to her feet. "You have been so kind, and I can never thank you enough. But I am desperately anxious about my poor aunt. I must know what is happening at Jamaica Inn." "Of course you are anxious," Mrs. Bassett said. "I will order the trap, and Richards, our groom, shall go with you. He is most trustworthy and dependable, and can be armed in case of need. "You will do nothing of the kind," said Mary swiftly. "I assure you I'm no longer tired, and I can walk." But Mrs. Bassett had already pulled the bell, and in a quarter of an hour the trap drove up to the door, with Richards in charge. Briskly the horse and trap covered the weary miles that Mary had walked alone. As they drew near to the summit of the steep hill to Jamaica, Richards turned to Mary and whispered, "Would it be best for you to wait here in the trap by the side of the road, and I go forward and see if they are there?" Mary shook her head. "Better for me to go," she said. "It seems as though the squire and his party are not yet come after all, and that the landlord has escaped. Should he be there, however, I can risk an encounter with him when you could not. Give me a pistol and let me go. Should you hear a shot fired, come after me, but come warily." She had spoken to Richards with confidence, but for all that she dreaded an encounter with her uncle. She levelled her pistol, her finger upon the trigger, and looked round the corner of the stone wall to the yard. It was empty. The stable door was shut. The inn was as dark and silent as when she had left it several hours before, and the windows and the door were barred. Then she heard the pony move restlessly in his stall. So they had not gone, and her uncle was still at Jamaica Inn. Her heart sank. She stood by the porch and listened. She even tried the handle of the door. It was locked, of course. She ventured a little way round the corner of the house, past the entrance to the bar, and so to the kitchen, which was black as a pit. She laid her hand on the knob of the door and slowly turned it. It gave, to her astonishment, and the door opened. She pushed it wide and went inside. There was a candle on the table, and she thrust it into the feeble glow of the fire and held it high and looked about her. The kitchen was still strewn with the preparations for departure. In the corner of the room was her uncle's gun. The door to the passage was wide open, and the silence became strangely and horribly still. Something was not as it had been. Some sound was lacking. Then Mary realized that she could not hear the clock. The ticking had stopped. She stepped into the passage and turned the corner and saw that the clock had toppled forward and fallen upon its face. It was not until she came to the foot of the stairs that Mary saw what was beyond. The landlord of Jamaica Inn lay on his face amongst the wreckage. There was blood on the stone floor, and blood between his shoulders, dark now and nearly dry, where the knife had found him. Mary backed away from the hall towards the passage, and ran like a thing pursued across the yard to where the stalwart figure of the squire's groom confronted her. "He's dead," she said, her teeth chattering now in the full shock of reaction. "He's dead, there on the floor, stabbed in the back. It must have happened several hours ago." "Was your aunt gone?" whispered the man. Mary shook her head. "I did not see. I had to come away. But something has happened to her as well. I know she is dead. Whoever killed my uncle will have killed her too." The man was silent. He wished that his master would come. Mary held up a warning hand. "Listen," she said sharply. "Can you hear something?" They strained their ears to the north. The faint clop of horses was unmistakable, coming over the brow of the hill. "It's them," said Richards excitedly. "It's the squire. He's coming at last." The clatter drew nearer, and Richards ran out upon the road, shouting and waving his arms. The leader swerved and drew rein, calling out in surprise at the sight of the groom. "What the devil do you do here?" shouted the squire. "The landlord is dead! Murdered!" cried the groom. "I have his niece here with me in the trap. It was Mrs. Bassett who sent me out here, sir." "If the fellow has been murdered, as you say, then by God it serves him right," said Mr. Bassett. "But I'd rather have clapped irons on him myself." He heard with astonishment how Mary had walked the long miles to North Hill in the hopes of finding him, and, not content with that, must return again to Jamaica Inn.
This is altogether beyond me, he said gruffly. I believed you to be in conspiracy with your uncle against the law. Why did you lie to me?
I lied because of my aunt, said Mary wearily. Nor did I know as much then as I do now.
Well, all that for later, said the squire. I can see you have endured enough.
He raised his voice and shouted for the servant. Take the trap up to the yard and stay with the young woman. Presently the bleak and silent house lost its shuttered air. Someone called sharply, and was answered by a murmur of voices and a question from the squire, who shortly after came out into the yard and crossed to the trap.
I'm sorry, he said. I have bad news for you. Perhaps you expected it.
Yes, said Mary.
I don't think she suffered at all. She must have died at once. She was lying just inside the bedroom at the end of the passage. Stabbed, like your uncle. She could have known nothing.
He stamped back across the yard to the inn. Mary sat motionless, shrouded in her cloak, and she prayed in her own way that Aunt Patience would forgive her and find peace now wherever she should be. Once again there came a murmur of excitement from the house, and this time there was shouting and the sound of running feet. There was a crash of splintering wood, and the shutters were torn away from the window of the barred room. Round the corner to the yard came 6 or 7 men, holding amongst them something that squirmed and wriggled and fought for release with hoarse, bewildered cries. Mary looked down upon the captive. It was Harry the pedlar.
"What do you know of this fellow?" the squire said to Mary. "We found him in the barred room. He denies all knowledge of the crime."
"He was of the company," said Mary slowly, "and he came to the inn last night and quarrelled with my uncle, who locked him up in the barred room, threatening him with death. He had every reason to kill my uncle."
"But the door was locked upon him. It took 3 of us to break it down," said the squire. "This fellow had never been from the room at all. He's not your murderer. Whoever did it knew nothing of this rascal, and he's no use to us as a witness. But he shall turn king's evidence and give us the names of his companions. Take this fellow to the stable, some of you, and hold him there."
Mary waited. She remembered a voice that had spoken calm and cold, saying of his brother, "He shall die for this." The truth stared up at her in ugliness and horror. She heard the clop of a horse upon the road and turned her head and listened, nerves strung now to the limit. The sound of the horse drew nearer, trotting at a steady, even pace. As the rider topped the summit of the hill and rounded the wall into view, the squire came out of the inn. "Stop!" he called. "In the name of the king, I must ask your business on the road tonight." The horseman drew rein and turned into the yard. The black riding cape gave no clue to his identity, but when he bowed and bared his head, the thick halo of hair shone white under the moon, and the voice that spoke in answer to the squire was gentle and sweet. "Mr. Bassett of North Hill, I believe," he said, and he leant forward in his saddle with a note in his hand. "I have a message here from Mary Yellan of Jamaica Inn, who asks my help in trouble. I am the vicar of Alternan." When Francis Davy offered his home for shelter, Mary had accepted meekly and without feeling. The vicar had driven her himself and had roused his housekeeper, who had prepared a bed for her. He had brought her hot drink, and the last that she remembered was his hand upon her forehead and those still, white eyes that told her to forget. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon before she woke, and the 14 hours of sleep had done their work. But when she went below to the living room to find the fire burning and the curtains drawn, and the vicar abroad upon some business, the old nagging sense of insecurity returned to her, and Jem's face was ever present with her, as she had seen it last, drawn and haggard. He had been the unknown factor from the beginning, but she loved him, and he was safe from her. As Mary prowled about the room, her mind as restless as her body, she came on some canvases with their faces to the wall close to an easel. Curious to see the vicar's work, Mary turned the paintings one by one until she saw a drawing which represented the interior of a church and its congregation. At first she saw nothing unusual in the sketch, but when she looked closer, she realized what he had done. It was not a drawing at all, but a caricature, grotesque as it was horrible. The thing was a mockery, blasphemous and terrible. Mary covered it quickly and sat down in the chair beside the fire. She had stumbled upon a secret that concerned her not at all, but rested between the draftsman and his God. When she heard the vicar's footstep on the path outside, she rose hurriedly and moved her chair so that its back was to the door. She sat there, waiting for him, but he was so long in coming that she turned at last to see him standing behind her. She started in surprise. "Forgive me," he said. "You did not expect me so soon, and I have blundered into your dreams." She shook her head and stammered an excuse. "Have you eaten today?" he said, and when she told him she had not, he took out his watch and noted the time, a few minutes before 6. "Hannah will have left the supper prepared. Please bring it at 6:45, he said, turning his back on her, and she gathered she was dismissed. She made her way to the kitchen, and when the clock chimed the 3/4, she carried the tray to the living room, hoping that nothing of her inner feelings showed upon her face. He had pulled the table in readiness before the fire. They sat down, and he helped her to the cold pie. "Is curiosity dead in Mary Yellan, that she does not ask me what I have done with my day?" he said at length, mocking her gently and bringing the flush of guilt to her face. "It is no business of mine where you have been," she answered. "You are wrong there. I have meddled in your affairs the livelong day. You asked for my help, did you not?" Mary was ashamed and hardly knew what to reply. "I have not thanked you yet for coming so promptly to Jamaica Inn," she said, "nor for my bed last night and my sleep today. You think me ungrateful." "I never said that. I have been to North Hill where Mr. Bassett entertained me to luncheon. There were 8 or 10 of us present, and we were all of one accord that the murderer of your uncle will not remain at liberty for long." "Does Mr. Bassett suspect anyone?" Mary's tone was guarded, and she kept her eyes on her plate. "Mr. Bassett is ready to suspect himself. He has questioned every inhabitant within a radius of 10 miles, and the number of strange persons who were abroad last night is legion. But no matter, Mr. Bassett is not deterred." "And the peddler? They have not let him go?" "No. He is safe under lock and key. It is a pity for all of us that barred room proves him innocent. He would have made an excellent scapegoat and saved a deal of trouble. I feel it very remiss of the murderer not to have looked into the barred room." "You mean he might have killed him too?" "Precisely. The peddler, in a hopeless attempt to save his own skin, has turned King's evidence. The organization appears to have been far larger than was hitherto supposed." Mary said nothing. "In fact," continued the vicar, "he went so far as to suggest that the landlord of Jamaica Inn was their leader in name only, and that your uncle had his orders from one above him. That should narrow the field considerably. Did you ever see such a person at Jamaica Inn?" "No, never." "Did I tell you I saw an acquaintance of yours today?" "No, you did not. I have no friends but yourself." "Thank you, Mary Yellan. That is a pretty compliment. But you have an acquaintance. You told me so yourself." "I don't know who you mean, Mr. Davy." "Come on. Did not the landlord's brother take you to Launceston Fair?" "The landlord's brother?" she repeated, playing for time. "I believed him to be away." "No. He has been in the district since Christmas. It had come to his ears that I had given you shelter, and he came up to me with a message for you. 'Tell her how sorry I am.' I presume he referred to your aunt." "Was that all he said?" "I believe he would have said more, but Mr. Bassett interrupted us." "Mr. Bassett was there when he spoke to you?" "Why, of course, it was just before I came away from North Hill this evening, when the discussion was closed for the day." "Why was Jem Merlyn present at the discussion?" "He had a right, I suppose, as brother of the deceased." "Did Mr. Bassett and the gentleman question him?" "There was a considerable amount of talk amongst them the whole day. Young Merlyn appears to possess a far better brain than his brother ever had, and when a chance came for him to use his intelligence, he took it. And small blame to him." The gentle voice wore away at her nerves, pin-pricking them, and she could no longer keep up the pretense of indifference. She lifted her face to him, her eyes heavy with the agony of restraint, and she spread out her hands in supplication. "What will they do to him, Mr. Davy? What will they do to him?" The pale, expressionless eyes stared back at her, and for the first time she saw a shadow pass across them, and a flicker of surprise. "Do?" he said, obviously puzzled. "Why should they do anything after the service he has done them?" I don't understand you. What service has he done?" "Did you not know that it was Jem Merlyn who informed against his brother?" She stared at him stupidly, her brain clogged and refusing to work. "Jem?" "Why, certainly," he said. "So Mr. Bassett gave me to understand. It appears that it was the squire himself who fell in with your friend at Launceston on Christmas Eve and carried him off to North Hill. 'You've stolen my horse,' said he, 'and you're as big a rogue as your brother. I have the power to clap you in jail tomorrow, but you can go free if you bring me proof that your brother at Jamaica Inn is the man I believe him to be.' Your young friend said, 'No, you must catch him yourself if you want him. I'm damned if I'll ever have truck with the law.' I gather your friend slipped his chain and ran for it in the night, and then came back again yesterday morning and went straight to the squire and said, as cool as you please, 'Very well, Mr. Bassett, you shall have your proof.'" Mary stared before her, the evidence she had so fearfully and so painfully built against the man she loved, collapsing into nothing. "What else did Jem Merlyn say and do?" she asked. The vicar glanced at his watch and replaced it with a sigh. "It was his last remark that hurried me home. He announced his intention of riding over tonight to visit the blacksmith at Warlegan." "What has it to do with you if he visits the blacksmith?" "He will show the nail he picked up in the heather down in the field below Jamaica Inn this morning. The nail, a new one, comes from a horse's shoe. Jem Merlyn, being a stealer of horses, knows the work of every blacksmith on the moors." "Well, and what then?" said Mary. "Yesterday was Sunday, was it not? And on Sunday no blacksmith plies his trade unless he has great respect for his customer. Only one traveller passed Tom Jorry's smithy yesterday and begged a new nail for his lame horse, after which the traveller continued his journey by way of Jamaica Inn." "How do you know this?" said Mary. "Because the traveller was the vicar of Alternan," he said. A silence had fallen upon the room. Each waited for the other to speak, and Mary heard Francis Davy swallow once. He leant forward in his chair with an abrupt change of subject. "You lost your confidence in me today. You found a drawing. No, I did not see you. I saw it had been moved, and it frightened you. You said to yourself, 'This man is a freak of nature.' You were right there, Mary Yellan. I am a freak in nature and a freak in time, and I was born with a grudge against the age and against mankind. However, we can talk of these things later, when the heat and turmoil of pursuit is not upon us." Mary looked up at him, her hands gripping the sides of her chair. "I don't understand you, Mr. Davy." "Why, yes, you understand me very well. You know by now that I killed the landlord of Jamaica Inn, and his wife too. Nor would the peddler have lived had I known of his existence. Joss Merlyn served me well. No other man knew the secret of our partnership. Your uncle brought his death upon himself by disobedience. I knew that you would betray him at the first excuse. He had to die, Mary Yellan, before, to save his neck, he named me master. But no, you would not have died. You would have come with me then as you will come tonight." "You are wrong," she said. "You would have killed me then as you will kill me now. I am not coming with you, Mr. Davy." "Understand me. The house is empty, and I am stronger than you would suppose. I don't want to harm you, Mary Yellan, or spoil that trace of beauty you possess. Come, where is that spirit of adventure which you have made your own?" Mary saw by the clock that it was 8:30, and by now Jem would have spoken with the blacksmith at Warlegan, and Jem was not the fool that she had been. If she went now with Francis Davy, she would be that same stumbling block she had been to him from the beginning. She smiled then, and looked into his eyes. "I'll come with you, Mr. Davy, but you'll find me a thorn in the flesh and a stone in your path. You will regret it in the end. Come as enemy or friend, that does not matter to me. I'll teach you to live, Mary Yellan, as men and women have not lived for 4,000 years or more." She followed Francis Davy to the stable where the horses were saddled. She climbed onto the grey, and he mounted the bay cob with the grey attached to him by a leading rein, and they set out upon their fantastic journey like two pilgrims. They came to the great black heart of the moor, where there were no tracks and no paths, but only the coarse tufted grass and the dead heather. But Francis Davy knew their secret, and cut through the darkness like a blind man in his home. "Where are we bound?" Mary asked, and he turned to her, smiling beneath his shovel hat, and pointed to the north. "The Atlantic has been my friend before, and a ship it will be that shall carry us from Cornwall." "So we are to leave England, are we, Mr. Davy?" "What else would you suggest? After today the vicar of Alternan must cast himself adrift from Holy Church and become a fugitive." They rode on in silence, and after a while it seemed to Mary that the darkness of the night became intensified. The horses picked their way delicately, and now and again stopped in their tracks and snorted, as though in fear, uncertain of their steps. Her companion leant forward in his saddle, straining his eyes to the darkness, and she heard him swallow. The little trick put an edge upon her fear. She watched the damp mist rise from the low ground, and then, in front of them, barring their further progress, rolled a great bank of fog out of the night, a white wall that stifled every scent and sound. Francis Davy drew rein, and the two horses obeyed him instantly, trembling and snorting. He turned to Mary, his white masked face as inscrutable as ever. "The gods have gone against me after all. I know these fogs of old, and this one will not lift for several hours. To continue now amongst the marshes would be worse madness than to return. We must wait for the dawn." He took her rein and urged the horses to the left, away from the low ground, until the yielding grass gave place to firmer heather and loose stones. "There will be rest for you after all, Mary Yellan. Tonight you shall sleep on Rough Tor." Later, Mary sat shrouded in her cloak like a phantom figure, with her back against a hollow stone. Francis Davy watched her, his chin upon his hands. She was cold. Her hands were numb, and her feet had lost all feeling. Her brain kept falling on and off into a dream, and he walked into it, a giant, fantastic figure with white hair and eyes, who touched her throat and whispered in her ear. She woke from this dream to certainty, feeling his hand upon her mouth, and this time it was no hallucination of a wandering mind, but grim reality. She would have struggled with him, but he held her fast, speaking harshly in her ear and bidding her be still. He forced her hands behind her back and bound them, neither hastily nor brutally, but with cool and calm deliberation, using his own belt. He took a handkerchief from the pocket of his coat and folded it, and placed it to her mouth, knotting it behind her head. "I have to do this, Mary, for both our sakes. When we set forth last night, I reckoned without the mist. If I lose now, it will be because of it. Listen. Your ears may be sharper than mine." She must have slept longer than she thought, for the darkness had broken above their heads and morning had come. The fog was with them still, and hid the moors below like a white blanket. She listened as he had bade her, and far away from beneath the mist there came a sound between a cry and a call. It came nearer, rending the air with some excitement, and Francis Davy turned to Mary. "Do you know what it is?" She shook her head. She had never heard the sound before. He smiled then, a slow, grim smile that cut into his face like a wound. "I heard once, and I had forgotten it, that the Squire of North Hill kept bloodhounds in his kennels. It is a pity for both of us, Mary, that I did not remember. Come, friend or enemy, we share a common danger now." They scrambled up the hill amongst the boulders and the slabs of granite, he with his arm about her, for her bound hands made progress difficult, to the great peak of Rough Tor. Here Mary lay beneath the great stone slab, breathless and bleeding from her scratches. He bent and dragged her to her feet again, cutting at the belt that bound her and tearing the handkerchief from her mouth. "Save yourself if you can," he shouted, his eyes burning in his pale face, his white halo of hair blowing in the wind. He climbed above her. The baying of the hounds was unearthly and inhuman, coming as it did from the blanket of fog below, and the chorus was joined by the cries and the shouting of men, a turmoil of excitement that was the more terrible because it was unseen. Then the mist parted and dissolved. Mary looked down upon little dots of men standing knee-deep in the heather. Somebody shouted, and a man who knelt in the heather scarcely 50 yards from Mary lifted his gun to his shoulder and fired. She saw the man was Jem. The tall black figure of Francis Davy outlined against the sky, standing upon a wide slab like an altar, high above her head, flung out his arms as a bird throws his wings for flight, and drooped suddenly, and fell, down from his granite peak to the wet, dank heather and the little crumbling stones. It was a hard, bright day in early January. Mary walked alone on 12 Men's Moor, with Kilmar to the left of her. The moors were bleak still, and the hills were friendless, but their old malevolence had vanished. She was at liberty now to go where she would, and she had a queer, sick longing for home in her heart and the sight of warm, familiar faces. She had determined her course, and would make it known to the Bassets when she returned for the midday meal. They were kind and full of suggestions, and had put to her with kindly tact that they would employ her in some position in the household. There are flowers to be cut for the house and letters to write and the children to scold. You'd have your hands full, I promise you." Mary strove in gratitude to do her best, but she knew she must go away from North Hill very soon, for these people were not her people, and only amongst the woods and streams of her own Helford Valley would she know peace and contentment again. It was a hard, bright day in early January. Mary walked alone on 12 Men's Moor, with Kilmar to the left of her. The moors were bleak still, and the hills were friendless, but their old malevolence had vanished. There was a cart coming towards her from Kilmar. She watched it in suspicion, for there were no cottages on this moor except Trewither, and Trewither, she knew, stood empty. Nor had she seen its owner since that day on Rough Tor. "He's an ungrateful rascal like the rest of his breed," said the squire. "But for me he'd be in jail now with a long sentence to serve. I forced his hand, and I granted it well after that, and it was the means of tracing you, and that black-coated scoundrel, but he's never as much as thanked me for clearing his name in the business, and has taken himself to the world's end now, for all I know." Mary shielded her eyes from the sun to watch the cart's progress. The horse bent to the strain, and she saw that it laboured beneath a strange load of pots and pans and mattresses and sticks. Someone was making for the country with his home upon his back. It was not until the cart was below her and the driver, walking by the side, looked up to her and waved that she recognized him. She went down with a fine show of indifference, and turned at once to pat the horse, while Jem kicked a stone under the wheel. "Are you better? I heard you were sick, and had taken to your bed." "You must have heard wrong," said Mary. "I've been about the house at North Hill." "There was a rumour you were to settle there, and be companion to Mrs. Bassett. No doubt they're kindly people when you know them." "They've been kinder to me than anyone else in Cornwall since my mother died. But I'm not staying in North Hill. I'm going back home to Helford." "What will you do there?" "I shall try and start the farm again. I've friends that will help me at the beginning." "Where will you live?" "There's not a cottage in the village I couldn't call home if I wanted to." Mary ran her eye over his laden cart and the confusion he had there. "What are you doing with that?" she asked him. "I want to get away from the smell of peat and bog, and the sight of Kilmar yonder, with its ugly face frowning upon me from dawn to dusk. Here's my home, Mary, all I've ever had of it, and I'll take it with me and set it up wherever my fancy takes me. I've been a rover since a boy, and I dare say I'll die a rover. It's the only life for me." "There's no peace, Jem, in wandering, and no quiet. There'll come a time when you'll want your own plot of ground, and your 4 walls, and your roof, and somewhere to lay your poor tired bones." "The whole country belongs to me, Mary, with the sky for a roof and the earth for a bed. I'll sleep on the hills one night, and in a city the next. I like to seek my fortune here and there and everywhere, with strangers for company and passers-by for friends." "Which way will you go?" said Mary. "Somewhere east of Tamar. I thought of making for the Midlands. They're rich up there. There'll be fortune there for a man who goes to find it. Perhaps one day I'll buy horses instead of stealing them." "It's an ugly black country in the Midlands," said Mary. "I don't bother about the colour of the soil. Moorland peat is black, isn't it? And so's the rain when it falls into your pigsties down at Helford. What's the difference?" "You just talk for argument, Jem. There's no sense in what you say." "How can I be sensible when you lean against my horse with your wild daft hair entangled in his mane, and I know that in 5 or 10 minutes' time I shall be over the hill yonder without you?" He went round to the back of the cart and kicked the stone away from the wheel. "What are you doing?" said Mary. "It's past noon already, and I ought to be on the road. If you were a man, I'd ask you to come with me, as long as it pleased you." I'd do that now if you'd take me south. Yes, but I'm bound north. And you're not a man. You're only a woman, as you'd know to your cost if you came with me. He took her face in his hands and kissed it, and she saw that he was laughing. When you're an old maid in mittens down at Helford, you'll remember that. He climbed into the cart and looked down upon her, flicking his whip and yawning. "I'll do 50 miles before tonight," he said. "I'll kindle a fire and cook bacon for my supper. Will you think of me or not?" She stood with her face towards the south, hesitating and twisting her hands. Beyond those hills the peace and quiet of Helford waited for her beside the running water. He drew the reins into his hands and whistled to the horse. "Wait," said Mary. "Wait, and hold him still, and give me your hand." He laid the whip aside and reached down to her, and swung her beside him on the driver's seat. "What now? If you come with me, it'll be a hard life, and a wild one at times. You'll get a poor exchange for your farm, and small prospect of the peace you crave." "I'll take the risk, Jem." "Do you love me, Mary?" "I believe so." "Better than Helford?" "I can't ever answer that." "Why are you sitting here beside me, then?" "Because I want to. Because I must. Because now and forevermore, this is where I long to be." He laughed then, and took her hand, and gave her the reins, and she did not look back over her shoulder again, but set her face towards the Tamar.